What if I told you that a new statistical measure rates Geno Smith as the best quarterback in the NFL? Hold the phone, take a breath. This metric, developed by Corbin Smith of Locked On Seahawks and All Seahawks, friend of the show, Seahawks beat reporter, measures a quarterback's performance over the last 2 years versus how much money he's making. It's called Bang for Your Buck. It's fascinating, and we're going to dive into it today with Corbin Smith on Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
Get the business out of the way, hit that like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and hit the bell for notification of future episodes. Other ways you can support the show is with a super thanks or by buying me a coffee. Those links will be in the description. Also, subscribe on any audio platform. If you want to listen to episodes without ads, you can do so on Spotify for a low monthly fee. And if you really like what I do, leave a review or a rating on whichever platform you use. Let's get into this. You've seen Corbin on the show many times. We've gotten to know each other well over the years and done a lot of things together. And I am really fascinated by this breakdown that he did looking at quarterback value relative to salary. And there's one particular young quarterback who's recently gotten paid that was sort of at the forefront of motivating Corbin to look for a way to quantify this type of value and how quarterbacks are paid relative to their production. So regardless of what you think about Geno Smith, if you like him or don't, try to go into this with an open mind, listen to what Corbin has to say, hang around for the duration of the interview, because I do ask him about how things might look if he plugged different stats or measures into his formula. Here's Corbin Smith on his Bang for the Buck quarterback rating system. Always good to have Corbin Smith on the show from Locked On Seahawks and All Seahawks, and especially now because we get to talk about a new stat. These don't come along every day. Corbin, how you doing? Are you ready for training camp?
I'm getting a little bit restless at this point. I know a lot of the other media members are like, 14 days, that's too quick. It is starting earlier than usual, but I guess I'm in the minority where I'm excited that it's starting earlier, so.
Yeah, it's always one of those things. I always feel this way about baseball too in early January. Like it feels like the start of camp is forever away, but it'll be here next week. So it's on top of us. And you have used quite a bit of your time this offseason doing something that I find really fascinating. About a week and a half ago, you came out with a new quarterback metric called Bang for Your Buck, where you try to put into context a quarterback, a veteran, established, experienced quarterback's value relative to how much money they're making. What was the genesis of this? Where did this idea come from, and how long have you been working on this?
So I don't want to make it sound like this was something that I spent like 5 weeks trying to come up with. It was something I just thought of on a random Saturday, and then I put about 10 hours of research in, and then I wrote up the article. So I'm not going to sit here and say that I have spent my entire offseason trying to come up with this. But one of the things that, and this is not as a Seahawks reporter, this is just an NFL observer in general, I have just been flabbergasted by the way that so many people, a lot of Seahawks fans included, the way that they view Geno Smith. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that he's in the same class as Patrick Mahomes. Nobody's going to be making that argument, but I think he is very much a top 10 quarterback based on what we've seen the last 2 years, especially with the O-line issues Seattle had last year. So you look at the contract. I saw some fans complaining about the fact that he's going to be making $25 million per year over the next 2 years. And I'm thinking, do you guys realize what you're saying here? Geno Smith is the lowest paid of the veteran established quarterbacks. So I'm like, there's got to be a way. And I didn't know what the results were going to look like, but I thought there's got to be a way that we can encompass all the things that are valuable for evaluating a quarterback. And I know there's not a perfect system for this, but I was trying to look at accuracy, big plays, game-winning drives. I mean, you need quarterbacks that can play well in the clutch. That is crucial for winning football games. So I looked at 9 different categories, and then I had a scoring system in place, divided it by the salary, and that gave the bang for buck value. And basically what I was just trying to look at is which team's getting the best value for their penny with their quarterbacks they're paying all this money for, especially with these guys. We've seen Trevor Lawrence, Joe Burrow. Soon you're going to add Tua Tagovailoa to this mix. Guys are getting $50+ million per year. You start to get to a point where you're like, okay, is there going to be a line that you cross where this is no longer worth paying this? And so I was very fascinated to see how these players and their stats bared out with their salary, which teams were going to get the most value.
You mentioned Trevor Lawrence. This kind of lines up timing wise, that Saturday you're talking about, with when he signed his new deal, $55 million annual, APV. And really, he was the first one. I know that when you have a young franchise quarterback, you got to pay him to keep him. The quarterbacks are hard to find. But we saw what happened 3-4 years ago with Dak Prescott, who most people agreed was one of the better quarterbacks in the league, and how reluctant Dallas was to just hand out a big contract to him right away. And that drama kind of played out over a couple of off seasons. That never happened in Jacksonville. Was Lawrence's deal, which in my opinion, I've never really been all in on the Lawrence camp. I just haven't seen it in him ever since he was anointed as a true freshman as the next big thing. Was that kind of one of the impetus of this that kind of opened your eyes to, hey, we need to attach some value to this?
It is the sole event that spurred me to come up with this bang for buck formula, because I don't dislike Trevor Lawrence. I think that he was worthy of getting a contract. The problem is now that these teams are just having to keep dishing out record-breaking contract. They're basically being held at gunpoint is what's happening here, is that agents are saying, hey, if you're not going to pay that kind of money, then you don't have a quarterback. And what are you going to do then? And so teams are paying that kind of money out. But this contract in particular, when it goes with Geno Smith, I was just thinking, I'm really curious if Geno Smith got that kind of a contract, which player would offer you more value? Because I think Geno Smith has been the better quarterback the last 2 years between these two guys. And as I continue to dive into stats, it's like, this is actually not that close in a lot of metrics. Geno Smith is significantly better than Trevor Lawrence. On film, he is better than Trevor Lawrence. So I was just wondering, and there was a few other quarterbacks that were in that mid-level, even Patrick Mahomes, who I think is a great value now for the contract that the Chiefs have him on. I just was very curious how the contracts that are being handed out to these players, especially with Lawrence really being the catalyst for them. Like, God, if you're paying $55 million per year for Trevor Lawrence, like, I want to know what kind of value you're getting in terms of pennies on the dollar. And I just wanted to see how that bared out with all these quarterbacks. So yes, Trevor Lawrence's contract definitely was kind of the impetus for that got me thinking, is there a formula we can come up with where we can really try to assess which quarterbacks provide the most value for the money they're being paid?
Now, we're going to show this table in just a moment so we can see what your final rankings look like. You mentioned the different categories that you put in here, but you did some other things to narrow the field down so that we're only talking about quarterbacks that play a lot, right? So that a guy like Mason Rudolph's not going to pop up on this chart because he played a couple of good games at the end of last year. What were some of the cutoffs that you used to narrow this field?
So I did 300 pass attempts for the 2 seasons, and that allowed somebody like Aaron Rodgers to still be on this ranking since he only got 4 plays last year before he popped his Achilles. But 300 snaps, that was the minimum or 300 pass attempts. That was the minimum that I had there. And I took players on rookie contracts out of the mix too, because obviously guys that are on rookie deals, especially non-first round picks like a Brock Purdy, for example, he would have scored off the charts on this just by default on the contract he's on. Now, when he gets his extension, I'm going to revisit this. I'm going to plug his numbers in, his stats and all that stuff, and we'll try to come up with his bang for buck formula with his new contract he signed to the 49ers. But rookie quarterbacks I kept out of there. Quarterbacks on their rookie deals until they get a new contract. So somebody like a Tua Tagovailoa, even Jordan Love, who is a player that has a new contract per se on a 1-year deal, but he's not on that massive extension. I did not include him on here either. Gardner Minshew I considered at $12 million, but I made the cutoff 25 million with Geno Smith's contract just because that's the gap we're looking at from Geno to Love and Minshew, where there really isn't a middle class for quarterbacks in the league.
Here's what you come up with when we look at all of that. Now, when you went and punched all this in and hit enter, did you expect Geno to come out on top?
I thought Geno was going to be in the top 2 or 3. I was not sure if he was going to be number 1, but I'm looking at this chart, Dan, that I put together, and the reason that I was pretty sure he was going to be in the top 2 or 3, for one, I mean, the salary, that value at 25 million, that is obviously the lowest on this list that we have here. So that's going to be a benefit for him on this, but you also have to have the numbers. Patrick Mahomes finished high on this, and he's making almost 50 million per year. So you still got to have the numbers. But I was looking, and Geno Smith, he was in the top 3 or 4 for completion percentage, for yardage, in the top 6 for touchdowns. He was in the top 6 for interception rate. He was number 1 in drives. Percentage above expectation, he was number 2. I mean, you start adding all these things up, and the points that I was dishing out in intervals of 5 points, and it started to become clear to me. I'm like, just looking at that, like that should tell you right now, Geno Smith has been a top 5 or top 6 quarterback, because he is almost in every one of these categories in the top 5 or 6. And then you add in the fact that he is the lowest paid quarterback on this list. I expected he was going to be very high, but what really surprised me was what happened when I changed his salary to 50 million. Right, that was really the biggest surprise to me.
Yeah, because there's been some tremendous debate. I've seen it all over your timeline since you posted this, and we'll get into that a little bit. But one of the first things was, well, of course he's going to come out on top because he's making so much less, 25 million APY, and number 2, Dak Prescott's at 40 million, and nobody else is lower than Derek Carr's 37.5. It fascinates me that you were able to play around with it a little bit. The other criticism that you got early on was, well, you're missing something here in the categories you chose because you're taking rushing stats out of it, which would really elevate someone like a Lamar Jackson. But you looked at it that way as well, didn't you?
Yeah, so I didn't edit the article because, for one thing, it was like 2,900 words, and I didn't feel like adding more stuff to it. But what I did is, on my X account, my social media accounts, I was able to really quickly put rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. And to me, this was one that those 2 stats really quantify things for rushing for quarterbacks. We're not going to have something that's going to be able to tell you, scrambles versus design runs. I mean, you can look that stuff up, but it wouldn't have really had a bearing on this. But rushing yards and rushing touchdowns, the points put on the board, to me, those were the 2 most valuable. So I included those in. I did the same scoring system in intervals of 5. And guess what? Geno Smith is still in first place. In fact, looking at the chart right now, his big time, or his bang for buck rating, goes up to 0.346. Dak Prescott's number 2 at 0.2. So he nearly doubled Dak Prescott when you added in the rushing aspect. And players like Lamar Jackson moved up a few spots, but this was not going to suddenly make them a top 3 quarterback in terms of value. Geno Smith still ran away with this because he has been an efficient runner when he's had his opportunities.
Now, this has brought, the debate back to the forefront of how legitimate or how good people think Geno Smith is. And it's kind of gained some new life this week. Some national media members, Mina Kimes, has kind of gone back to the Pittsburgh game and has been tweeting out clips of that game and how good Geno was. And then his personal quarterback coach, Quincy Avery, has jumped into there as well. And he's been tweeting out pictures of Geno, throwing passes in his offseason workouts in a helmet and shoulder pad. Dan Orlovsky chimed in and said, no one throws a prettier ball in the league. And you consider all of that and all the respect he has from people who've played the game and analyzed the game professionally. And then you see these numbers that you've come up with. What is it that causes some people to just be unable to remove their blinders and see Geno for the talent that he has? Why are some people so close-minded about his ability?
I really think, Dan, the path he took to this renaissance is really what is behind that. I think that there are still a lot of fans that just 2 years later just can't believe that were looking at these numbers and they can't believe that this guy that was a backup for 3 different teams and didn't start for 5+ years. I don't think that they can fathom the idea that this is possible. This does not happen very often. I mean, Rich Gannon was the other one that jumped out to me when we were talking about Geno's first year as a starter. Hey, this rebirth, this is not something that you see very often, but he's now done it for 2 years. And last year, the more I look back on it, it was really impressive that he was able to do what he did with the way that offensive line struggled and all the injuries that they had. And that Steelers game was a perfect illustration of that, with his ability to get away from pass rushers. I mean, TJ Watt is usually an automatic sack if he gets in the backfield, and Geno made him miss at least 3 times in that game with his pocket movement. So I just think that pathway, this is not a typical situation where a guy was with a team for a couple years and then he figured things out. I mean, this player was almost on the verge of being out of the league at one point. And here we are now. We're talking about how well that he's played the last 2 years and the numbers, the film back it up. And I think the other thing that's worth noting here, and this is not fair to Geno Smith at all, but there are a lot of fans that look at his success and say, but he's 33 going on 34. He's not a 25-year-old quarterback. He's not the future of the franchise. And I think that's really the biggest issue here. When you're talking about players like Trevor Lawrence, you can still say, hey, he's 25 years old. There still could be a ton of upside with this player. Geno Smith, you're like, he's at the point of his career where he's probably plateaued, and who knows how long he's going to be able to play at this level because of his age. So there's certainly some unique factors, I think, that play into this. Do I agree with any of them? No. I think that I've seen enough to suggest to you that Geno Smith, this is a league that quarterbacks now can play really well deep into their 30s, and you add in the fact that he has less tread in his tires. I think there's counter arguments you can make in favor that, hey, he plays really well this year. I wouldn't rule out the fact this could still be your quarterback for the next 4 or 5 years because he is a guy that fits this scheme so well for Ryan Grubb. I truly believe that.
Certainly going to be a debate going into the offseason it'll be storyline number 1 in Seattle if he has a good season and is due for an extension. Especially, I can hear some of the critics out there looking at all this research you've done, all this work you've done, and looking at this chart and saying, well, you took the rookie quarterbacks out of it because it would skew it too much, but doesn't that also lend to the argument that you should be looking to build around a rookie quarterback moving forward? I could hear Geno detractors arguing that point.
Oh, yeah, and I was fully expecting that. But here's the issue, and you and I both know this. For every C.J. Stroud, there are a whole bunch of Trey Lances and Zach Wilsons.
Probably 2 to 3 for everyone, yeah.
In the first round. The odds of landing on a player, even with the number 1 pick, we've seen plenty of number 1 overall picks at quarterback in the last 25 years that have not panned out for one reason or another. It is far from a guarantee that you are going to land on a Joe Burrow who's going to come in and instantly make your team a contender, or a CJ Stroud. Those kind of players, it's one of those things. I mean, look at last year, Bryce Young, and maybe he turns things around with Dave Canales, who was instrumental in Geno Smith getting his career righted. Maybe Bryce Young still ends up being a really good NFL quarterback, but he wasn't good last year, not even close to CJ Stroud. So it goes back to that lottery ticket idea. Yes, everybody would love to have a Brock Purdy, but eventually that payday is going to come if you land on that quarterback, and you don't want to let that player go either. So I understand the argument, but I think that when you're a fan that is pushing the narrative that we need to do everything we can to just cycle through rookie quarterbacks, you don't want to win Super Bowls if that's what you're looking at, because you're not going to consistently be competitive if you're trying to play that musical chair with rookie quarterback contracts. There's a reason nobody's out there trying to do that. Maybe there comes a point where contracts get expensive enough that a couple teams try that. But to me, the hit rate is just not high enough to suggest that this is really the strategic move that the Seattle Seahawks should make here at the quarterback position, especially when you have a guy who has been really, really solid the last 2 years in Geno Smith.
Well, and that hit rate you talk about is mostly guys taken in the top 10. It gets even harder later in the draft, and you don't see many names on this list that weren't taken that high. Dak Prescott is one. Jalen Hurts is one. Obviously, Russell Wilson, we know that story. And so, I tell people all the time, look, just because this might be the route that they end up going for the next 3-4 years doesn't mean that right now, today, as well, maybe not today because it's early July and they might be on a beach somewhere before camp, but that when early draft prep starts for 2025, that Seahawks scouting staff isn't working extremely hard on this upcoming quarterback class just to make sure that they're fully aware of any possibility of getting a guy at some point that they think might be the long-term guy. If Geno has the kind of year that some of us suspect he might, with Ryan Grubb potentially in that offense he's bringing being an ideal fit for Geno Smith's skill set, what type of contract do you think we're looking at going into the offseason? Is it commensurate with, Kirk Cousins, $45 million a year at the age of 35, or Derek Carr at 37.5, maybe somewhere in between there? I mean, the salaries have gotten out of hand, but at some point, Geno's age, his experience, the pathway you talk about to getting here is going to limit ultimately those numbers a little bit, right?
Yeah, I don't see any team being willing to pay Geno Smith $55 million like Trevor Lawrence. I mean, even if he goes out and throws 40 touchdowns this year, maybe there might be some teams then that change their mind, because 34 is not what it was 20 years ago in terms of age. There still could be a lot of really good football left in him. And, he had the ACL tear early in his career, but he's generally been fairly healthy since then. Mm-hmm. So, you add in those factors, there might be some teams that are willing to pay a little bit more. But I think that contract Cousins signed, that $45 million range, is probably what you're looking at. And I think Geno also is very interested in winning. Dan, are you okay on there? Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, so you drop off. So
got rid of the chart and wanted to highlight you there for a second.
Okay. All right, I will continue. You can just edit this part out. But I think Geno at this stage of his career too. I saw this with the last extension that he signed. Like the incentives there, betting on himself. Yeah. I can see him still going that route to an extent, because I think he feels like the Seahawks, they gave him this opportunity. He wouldn't be here without the Seahawks granting him that chance. So I think that there's that back and forth where he's going to say, I still want the team to be able to be built around me. I don't want to have a contract that's going to make that extremely difficult, but I want to be paid what I deserve as well. So you find that balancing act. I think 45 million range there would make some sense. And like I said, on this chart, if I put in $50 million for Geno Smith's salary, I'm not saying he's getting that or that the Seahawks would be wise to do that, but he still finishes second place in the bang for buck metric if you jump his salary up to $50 million. That should tell you all you need to know about how effective he really has been the last 2 years, Dan.
Well, that is going to put a wrap on the bang for the buck conversation. But I want to pick your brain on a couple other things before I let you go, because we are just days away now, a week away from rookies reporting, full squad about 2 weeks away. NFL Network was talking this morning about the Seahawks and their defense, how good they might be under Mike Macdonald. And they had a bunch of guys on the panel, including Brian Baldinger. And the question came up of, what about the inside linebacker position? And this is one that is as much optimism as we've all talked ourselves into over this offseason, with how good some of these young position groups have looked and some of the talent that they've added in the last couple of off seasons, that's still the question mark. They move on from Jordan Brooks and Bobby Wagner. They bring in Terrell Dodson and Jerome Baker. One of the reporters on this panel this morning said, hey, I spoke to somebody in the Seahawks organization, and they feel like they've improved that position drastically when it comes to coverage. But we haven't seen Terrell Dodson and Jerome Baker on the field at all. What are you hearing? How confident are you that the optimism Mike Macdonald shared with us a few weeks ago, that he thinks those guys will be back and ready for training camp? Or when are we going to see them on the field? And if we don't, what then?
Based on the discussions that I had a few weeks ago, I think both these guys are going to be ready to at least be limited participants early in training camp. I expect Tyrell Dodson is going to be ready to go from, again, a limited snaps. There's going to be a pitch count standpoint because he hasn't done anything all offseason. But I think Dodson is going to avoid the PUP list. If one of these guys is going to start on the PUP list, and again, that could be for just 1 or 2 days. It could be for 2 weeks. We don't know. But Baker is the one, just because he's coming off wrist surgery. There were some lower body things he was working through too. From my understanding, Tyrel Dodson's injury situation, neither one of these is concerning for the organization, but Dodson, I think, is going to be better set to be ready to go, to be able to at least participate in some of the practice early on in training camp, and Baker's going to be just behind him there. So I do think that optimism that McDonald had, they were being cautious of these guys during OTAs and minicamp. I think there's a good chance that both these guys are going to be out there pretty early, and that's going to be crucial because they got to get these guys in the field. I think both of them have talent, but like you're jumping into a new defense, and it's one thing to learn it in the classroom. It's another thing to go out in the field and be able to learn how to play in this defense and be able to play with your new teammates. So getting those guys out there as quickly as possible, even if half the time they're just getting mental reps, that's still better than just being in the classroom trying to learn this defense.
And you had a guy on your podcast recently knows a thing or two about playing linebacker, former All-Pro Seahawk middle linebacker Lofa Tatupu. He's very high on these two guys, isn't he?
Yeah, especially Jerome Baker. That was the one he was raving about it. And I went back and watched more tape, and I would agree with one thing that Lofa Tatupu said. There were multiple things I agreed with him on, but I love the physicality for the guy being 6'2", 225, 230 Big Max this week. I mean, he is not a big linebacker at all, but he is not afraid to come up and whack offensive linemen. He plays a physicality. He can shed blocks. So this is not a prototypical tall, lanky linebacker that's looking to evade blockers. Is he capable of doing that? Yeah, but he also is capable of getting off of blocks. He has had a few injuries, and I think some of it's because of that body type and the playing style that he has. But there's a lot more film with Jerome Baker to suggest that this guy can do the things Mike McDonald wants. You see the 5 interceptions, the 22.5 career sacks. He is a very capable blitzer. So the things that Mike McDonald had success with his linebackers at Michigan and Baltimore doing, he's going to be able to do all those things with Jerome Baker as long as he's healthy. Dodson's the one that is really the wild card here, just because we don't have a very large sample size to work with. And going back and watching those 10 starts last year, there were some really good things, but I also saw him come off the field in passing situations pretty much every single time. And so to talk about coverage, the Bills didn't necessarily illustrate confidence there with keeping him on the field. So that is one of my big question marks here, is where does Tyrel Dodson fit in this equation?
And then I think the other thing that amongst the fan base where all eyes are going to go to as soon as camp opens is who's suited up and playing on the offensive line and who's lining up where and what does that depth chart look like, and especially right tackle. And we've seen some positive things kind of leak out little by little, and we've had to glean what we can from those moments. What are you hearing about Abe Lucas and his health?
I think there's a very good chance that Lucas is going to avoid the PUP list. I'm not going to sit here and guarantee it. Maybe the Seahawks will play cautious there. I would not be surprised by that. But the fact that he has been lifting, he's been running without a brace on his knee, I was told that that was kind of a big breakthrough in this situation for him. So I think there is a really good chance that he's at least going to be out there. I don't know if we're going to see him get a lot of snaps early. They got to get him weaned back in, obviously, but I do think there's a good chance. And even if he's on the PUP list, I would expect it's going to be one of those quick couple day things before they are able to get him out on the field. So from what I'm gathering, it sounds like there's a pretty good chance that that timeline they were hoping for is going to come into fruition there. Man,
that would be huge, especially with given the luxury of having George Fant now on the roster as well. Just an ideal veteran swing tackle that can play both sides. ESPN came out with an interesting piece a couple of days ago where they ranked NFL rosters groups of under 25 players. And you would immediately think, I did when I saw the headline, well, the Seahawks are going to be pretty high on that list because they have a young roster. And they have a lot of that talent was acquired through the last 3 drafts, and most of us feel pretty good about that. They were 10th. It's not bad. Were they, in your opinion, were they too low still at 10, or do you think that was fair?
Yeah, I broke this down on my Locked On Seahawks podcast yesterday. I understand the first 2 teams. To me, the first 2 teams are head and shoulders above everybody else. The Houston Texans, they are heavily bolstered by C.J. Stroud, obviously, what we saw last year. But they've got some other really good young players. Will Anderson, Tank Dell. There's a bunch of others. They've done a great job drafting the last couple of years. And then the Detroit Lions at number 2. Aiden Hutchinson, Jameson Williams, Campbell, Jahmyr Gibbs. I can keep rolling off names. I mean, under 25. I think St. Brown is still 25. So they've got a lot of really good young players. So those two teams I have no gripes about. And even Green Bay, to me, that's the other team and that you could really make a strong case in the top three ahead of Seattle, with Jordan Love still being 25 years old and some of the really good players they brought in the last 2 years. But beyond that point, there were several teams in front of Seattle. I'm like, really? I mean, are we forgetting the fact that Reek Woolen and Devin Witherspoon were both Rookie of the Year finalists? Are we forgetting the fact Ken Walker, the third, 2 straight years, 1,000+ scrimmage yards, has been really good with a crappy offensive line for most of the time? Jack Smith and Jigba coming on late. He's 22, so he's a puppy. You've got some other guys on defense. Boy, Mafe almost had 10 sacks last year. I just feel like Seattle probably needed to be in that 3 or 4 range. 10 seems way too low, in my opinion. I think adding Sam Howell here boosts that too.
I was just going to say, they have a 23-year-old quarterback. Yeah.
So, yeah, I felt like there were several teams in front of them, and some of it's positional value. Like, they didn't even mention Ken Walker III when talking about star players. Yeah. I feel like he's one of the most explosive backs in the league. So, and even Zach Charbonnet. I mean, I think Charbonnet's got a lot of talent. So, I felt like the thing that held him back here is the question marks about the offensive line, because you've got a lot of young guys in there like Oluwatimi, Anthony Bradford, Christian Haynes, McClellan Curtis. All those guys are 24 and under, but only one of those guys has more than one NFL start, and Anthony Bradford was pretty up and down in those 10 starts he had last year. So I can understand that weighing it down a little bit. If a couple of those guys hit, they're going to be much higher on this list next year. But I felt like there were several teams that shouldn't have been in front of them that were.
Yeah, I thought the Walker omission was really notable. I'm glad you brought that up. Any other storylines that you're really focused on here a week out from rookies reporting for camp?
I am very curious about that right guard position, because the offensive line, it's weird. You know, if we were having this conversation, I think we actually had this conversation on your podcast a few months ago, that I thought there might be open competitions at all 3 interior offensive line spots. I'm going into training camp now. Laken Tomlinson's going to be the guy at left guard.
Seems like it. Yeah.
There's not going to be competition there. Maybe Satao Lamea is going to be able to compete, you know, down the line to be a left guard for this team, but not right now. Laken Tomlinson brings you that veteran presence. I think this team is very high on Oluwatimi. They want him to be the guy. So he's going to have to really slip up and fall on his face not to be the starter there, in my opinion. But right guard is that competition that it is truly a 3-horse race. I think there are still a lot of fans like, okay, McClellan Curtis with no pads on, he's been the first team, whatever. I'm not paying attention. You should be paying attention. I think McClellan Curtis is very much in this competition. I would still project Christian Haynes is going to win this job. I'm still very high on him, but do not sleep on McClellan Curtis. I'm telling you, the guy, when you watch, there's just certain players that you watch do drills. I know hitting the sled is, you know, whatever. It doesn't define what's going to happen on the field. But there are just certain guys, Byron Murphy the second, when we get to see him for the first time, there's just certain guys that jump out. You're like, that dude's got it. When McClellan Curtis gets those long arms and he is smacking a sled, it is a sight to behold. If he is able to do that on defenders, which his college tape suggests to me that he very well could, if he can do that, Scott Huff has no allegiance to some of these, to any of these returning guys. If McClellan Curtis is the player that jumps out to him and he loves the versatility, oh, by the way, Curtis is actually the same age as Christian Haynes too. If Curtis ends up being that guy, I don't think the Seahawks are going to care if you're undrafted and they got a 3rd-round pick in. They're going to put the best player in. I think that is a 3-horse race there. Bradford maybe being the incumbent coming in, but that is going to be an incredibly competitive position group, and I'm fired up to see what's going to happen there.
That'll be interesting to watch, and I can hear some people, because you've heard from these fans too. Well, if McClellan Curtis beats out Christian Haynes, then they wasted a 3rd-round pick, right? There's that mindset out there. But I would hedge that, you know, we saw Christian Haynes play center at the Senior Bowl. It wouldn't be outside of the realm of possibility that maybe if Curtis is that dude and establishes himself at right guard, maybe Haynes is a guy that starts to get some left guard snaps, and maybe kind of learns behind Laken Tomlinson at least for a year, and is still love Christian Haynes, love the upside there. He's still a long-term starter moving forward. It's just a matter of what happens
Yeah, the thing is, Dan, and you and I both know this, when you're looking at competitions, what you're wanting is if McClendon Curtis does win this job, you want it to be because he outright won this job and he just was the best player. You don't want it to be a case where, yeah, he was okay, but the other two guys were just awful. Yeah. That's the worst case scenario. So you're hoping it's a case where everybody pushes each other and then McClendon Curtis just ends up being the best of the three. And in that case, I don't care where you were drafted. And Christian Haynes can move over to left guard, like you said. He can be the guy that learns. And then Laken Tomlinson, I don't think he's a long-term answer there for you at the left guard. Maybe Christian Haynes ends up being that player. Or Bradford. I mean, it gives you some flexibility. So, again, I think Haynes wins the job, but I would not be surprised if McClendon Curtis finds a way to get it done, because I've seen enough. And, I've talked to a couple of people at the facility, Ray Roberts, for example. Ray Roberts and I are both high on McClendon Curtis from what we've seen out there. So I'm interested to see how it all comes together. That is the position battle that is going to be under the microscope this entire training camp.
Well, Corbin, enjoy these next 6 days. It gets awfully busy for you. I know you said before we started recording, you're going to be up here for most of training camp. So we'll see you up here in the Pacific Northwest. Maybe we'll find an opportunity to get together then, but certainly we'll check in with you later on when you've had a chance to get your eyeballs on some of these guys for 3 weeks in pads. Live.
Yeah, in pads. That's the key. That's the key.
Indeed. All right, Corbin, thanks. You can look for him on Locked On Seahawks, of course, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, sometimes bonus episodes as news allows, and also read him on All Seahawks and his staff and the good work they do over there. Corbin, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Appreciate it.
Once again, that music you hear from Stephen Douglas and company, their new single, Dopamine. Stephen's a good friend of mine and love the music that he does. You'll hear him singing. He also plays harmonica. You can check that out on Spotify. Also, check out his other band, Colossal Boss, as well. Follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. And again, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We are getting close to it. Training camp coming up any day now. We are back after a month of just taking the foot off the gas a little bit, right? I'm sure some of you have done the same, and hopefully you're enjoying the weather wherever you are. It is hot as balls here in Seattle. And as soon as I say goodbye to you here, I'll be turning the AC back on again. Won't have to worry about anyone hearing that in the background. Thanks for watching, you guys. Until next time, forever and always, go Hawks.